I didn't argue when they shoved that eviction notice across the table. Instead, I calmly slid a yellowed 1924 deed for water rights right back at them and watched their faces pale as 34 shiny McMansions suddenly became lakefront property. The Oak Ridge Meadows HOA thought they could quietly snatch my grandfather's ranch while I was serving in Iraq. These smug rulemakers built their spotless suburban wonderland on stolen soil, complete with tennis outfit Karens buzzing around in golf carts. What they didn't know was that I'm an engineer with the Army Corps. That old earthen dam on my land had been sitting there for more than 4 decades, just waiting for someone foolish enough to build below it. Their arrogance was laughable, at least until the spillway gates opened and their perfect development got its first lesson in natural flooding. And believe me, this was going to be very satisfying. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment, because you're about to see the most dramatic HOA downfall caused by federal water law and plain gravity. Let me introduce myself. I'm Daniel Hayes, 35 years old, Army Corps of Engineers, and third-generation owner of 46 acres of Texas land just outside San Antonio. My grandfather, everyone called him Pops, bought this spread in 1956, back when San Antonio was a quiet town and barbecue stands outnumbered tech firms by 1,000 to 1. Pops was the kind of man who cared deeply about both the land and the people around it. In 1979, he built a modest earthen dam on our ranch. Nothing flashy, just solid engineering to catch rainwater for the cattle and to help downstream neighbors during dry summers. The Army Corps had even offered design input. Pops always said one day those back 40 acres would hold real value, but meanwhile, it was simply rolling hills where we grazed cattle and where I learned to hunt. Then came my deployments to Iraq, where I specialized in water systems and infrastructure. Managing wells in a desert combat zone taught me how precious water really is, and how fast people will fight over it. During my second tour, Pops passed away. The property shifted into a family trust, managed by my caring but overwhelmed sister, Emily, who lives out in California. She knows as much about Texas land law as I do about surfing. She hired a local company, Lone Star Property Services, to handle upkeep and taxes. The taxes kept getting paid, but here's the catch. Emily never actually looked at the county's assessment. Huge mistake. Enter the villain, Margaret Maggie Thornhill, age 51, president of Oak Ridge Meadows HOA. She drives a white BMW SUV and thinks tennis skirts are business attire. Maggie has mastered that polite, sugary tone that Southern women perfect in their 40s, the kind that makes you check your pockets while she smiles at you. She's married to City Councilman Richard Thornhill, which tells you exactly how she gets her way. Maggie is infamous for community beautification projects, which really means forcing out anyone who doesn't match her polished suburban vision. Behind her expensive perfume lingers the faint stench of cigarettes and entitlement. I came back from Iraq in September 2022, eager to finally spend some time on Pop's land. Driving down the old gravel road, past the oak tree where I carved my initials as a kid, I expected to see green pastures and that dam sparkling in the Texas sun. Instead, I found concrete trucks, survey stakes, and construction crews scattered across my back 40 like an invading army. The crunch of gravel beneath my boots felt heavier, angrier. Dust rose in the air as I marched toward the foreman. "Sorry, man," he said, sounding anything but. "We've got permits. This belongs to Oak Ridge Meadows now." I called the sheriff. Deputy Hernandez arrived, looking uncomfortable, and explained that the HOA had filed an adverse possession claim while I was overseas. Basically, if land sits unused for years, and someone shows they've been improving it, they can sometimes take ownership. It's an old law meant to prevent land from being wasted, but developers now abuse it to grow their empires. That's when Maggie herself rolled up in her little golf cart, acting like a suburban warlord. Her honeyed voice made my skin crawl. "Your family left this land behind, sweetie," she said with a fake smile. "We're just making it useful for the neighborhood." But the real punch to the gut? Her crews had diverted the small creek that fed Pop's dam. Each day, The water level was dropping, erasing 44 years of careful water management that had protected neighbors from both droughts and floods. As I stood there, watching the waterline sink, Maggie's smug words echoed in my head, "You should have stayed home, soldier boy." That was the moment I realized, this wasn't about land anymore. This was war. I rushed to hire a lawyer. Big mistake. His first quote. $82,000. All this just to force a zoning change. Turns out that while I was serving overseas, Maggie's husband, Richard, had slipped an emergency zoning adjustment through city council. Overnight, my family's ranch switched from agricultural use to residential development, faster than you can say political favor. But this is where my Army Corps background came in handy. While that overpriced attorney was shuffling paperwork and draining my wallet, I was combing through county files like I was back in Iraq searching for hidden explosives. And just like in the desert, the smallest details held the biggest truths. I uncovered Pop's original 1979 dam permits, and they were a thing of beauty. Pops hadn't built that dam alone, he'd done it hand in hand with the Army Corps of Engineers for watershed protection and flood management. That gave it federal oversight. Here's your first real gem: if a dam was designed with federal help, it falls under federal law. Local HOAs can't touch it. Period. The metallic tang of adrenaline hit my tongue when I realized what I had found. This wasn't just a land squabble anymore, it was a federal issue. And then, it got even better. While copying permits in the dusty courthouse basement, I uncovered a 1924 water rights deed my great-grandfather had purchased. Those rights covered the entire Oak Ridge Creek watershed. They were older than the city itself, older than the county's water system, older than every shiny McMansion now sitting on my property. They weren't only stealing my land, they were stealing my water. Meanwhile, Maggie was busy staging her little performance. She called an emergency HOA meeting about the dangerous dam, complete with a news crew she had tipped off. That night on TV, she stood on her pristine lawn, fake tears glistening as she claimed concern. "We're worried about our kids' safety," she sniffled. "That old dam looks ready to collapse, and families live just downstream." The thing about local news? They love a dramatic headline but rarely check the facts. Had they looked, they'd have seen my dam passed its latest inspection without a single problem. But Maggie wasn't finished. She jumped on the Nextdoor app, that digital gossip board where HOAs show off their power. Her post warned of unstable individuals and dangerous property conflicts. She never wrote my name, but she didn't have to. In a small community, everyone knew exactly who she meant. The August air was thick with cedar pollen and diesel fumes as I stood on my porch each evening, watching their crews work double shifts. They were desperate to finish those houses before I could stop them legally. Every night, I counted more foundation slabs. Every night, Pop's dam dropped another inch. That's when I called my old Army buddy, Anthony Riggs, now working at the EPA's Enforcement Division. 20 minutes on the phone with him taught me more about environmental law than my pricey lawyer had in 3 hours. "Daniel," he said, "if they're rerouting a natural creek without federal approval, that's a violation of the Clean Water Act. And since your dam has federal ties," he didn't even need to finish. I started gathering proof immediately. Trail cams hidden on the property. Time-stamped pictures of water diversions. Flow measurements at 3 points along the creek. My sister Emily rang me from California, pleading with me to just take the payout and move on. But this wasn't about money anymore. It was about the grind of heavy boots on soil that wasn't theirs. It was about the sound of Maggie's heels clicking across courthouse marble while she lied through zoning hearings. It was about the bitter taste of courthouse coffee as I uncovered how deep their corruption went. But above all, it was about that dam. Pops had built it for the community, so neighbors would have water during droughts. For 44 years, it had been a lifeline. Maggie's contractors were draining it into backyard ponds for their luxury homes. Here's the truth about Texas water law: water rights are older than oil rights, older than mineral rights, and 10 times tougher to steal. But only if you know how to fight. As another concrete truck rumbled past my kitchen window, I realized this wasn't going to be one in court with pricey lawyers. It would be one with engineering. Maggie escalated. She created what she proudly called a neighborhood safety patrol. 3 board members in identical polo shirts camped out by my gate like a suburban checkpoint. They wrote down plates, snapped pictures of visitors, and filed endless reports with the sheriff. The harassment was classic HOA intimidation. Noise complaints when I ran my radio, citations for old barns she called eyesores, and constant attempts to wear me down. The HOA's attacks kept piling up. Suddenly, my perfectly fine farmhouse, standing strong since 1963, was being flagged for supposed environmental hazards. Reports came in about my septic system, even though it had passed inspection only 6 months earlier. But the biggest insult came when Richard used his city council seat to order a wellness check on me through veteran services. On paper, I was now a troubled veteran, who might be struggling with readjustment. The social worker who showed up was sympathetic but thorough, clipboard in hand, while Maggie sat nearby in her golf cart like she was running a military drill. That's when the full-scale bureaucratic assault began. Building inspector, fire marshal, health department, and even animal control all rolled up the same day like some kind of regulatory strike team. Each one found minor violations that would cost thousands to fix. The building inspector, who just happened to be Richard's drinking buddy, claimed my porch needed $7,800 in foundation repairs. I knew exactly what this was. It was the same pressure tactic I'd seen used in conflict zones: bury someone in red tape until they break. But 2 could play that game. While they tried to drown me in paperwork, I made calls of my own. Tony Riggs from the EPA was very interested to hear Maggie's HOA never filed a wetlands review before rerouting Oak Ridge Creek. Federal law requires environmental clearance for any diversion of natural waterways, even on private land. And the penalties? They start at $50,000 per day. Every morning, the smell of fresh concrete curing under the Texas sun reminded me that time was slipping away. But my digging was paying off in ways Maggie hadn't expected. I uncovered records proving their entire subdivision was built on land classified as a 100-year floodplain by the Army Corps. At first, insurance companies refused coverage, until the HOA produced a so-called flood management plan. Their solution was to permanently redirect Oak Ridge Creek onto my ranch, turning Pop's Dam into a flood basin. Knowledge nugget number 2, lying about flood risk to get insurance isn't just shady, it's federal mail fraud. The more I researched, the clearer it became that this wasn't Maggie's first con. Back in Houston, her old HOA had paid a $2.1 million fine to the EPA for an almost identical creek diversion stunt. She'd skipped town before prosecutors caught up and set up shop here in San Antonio, looking for her next victims. While I built my case, Maggie tried to destroy my reputation. She whispered rumors about my mental health and violent temper, even hiring a private investigator to dig into my military record. She pushed a petition to have my property condemned as a public hazard. In interviews, she told the local paper, "We can't have unstable people threatening our families." Safety. Meanwhile, I was forming alliances. Online forums connected me with other HOA victims, and I started spotting a pattern. In the last 3 years, Maggie's HOA had absorbed 6 smaller properties using the same playbook: intimidation, bureaucracy, rezoning, and, always, Richard's construction firm profiting on the back end. I teamed up with Mrs. Chen, my elderly neighbor whose family garden had dried up since the creek diversion, and with Miguel Santos, whose farm Richard rezoned out of existence 2 years earlier. These weren't isolated incidents, they were part of a coordinated land grab. The constant rumble of heavy machinery under my farmhouse floors reminded me daily what I was up against. Each morning, I watched cement trucks roll past my window. Each night, I documented the dropping water levels in Pop's Dam. But I wasn't just watching anymore, I was preparing. I installed flow meters at both the dam outlet and the creek diversion. I calculated the exact theft. 1,200 gallons per day, valued at $47,000 annually in agricultural water rights. The gritty feel of sand slipping through my hands as I tested creek bed sediment was evidence better than any lawyer's words. This wasn't just theft. It was large-scale environmental destruction. Then came the certified letter. The city planned to seize my property under eminent domain for public safety. The hearing was set just 2 weeks away. Maggie's quote in the paper said it all: "Sometimes you have to protect the community from itself." But as I stood at my bedroom window that night, watching storm clouds build on the horizon, I knew those weren't just rain clouds. They were opportunity. Maggie had gone nuclear. Richard had rushed the eminent domain hearing, leaving me just 14 days. Then came the insult. The HOA offered me $175,000 for land appraised at $880,000. The message couldn't be clearer: take the lowball payout, or lose it all. The local newspaper even ran a smear piece. "Troubled veteran blocks community progress," headlines stamped above a photo that made me look like some kind of domestic threat. The smear campaign only got uglier. The local paper ran a photo that made my farmhouse look like some rundown drug den, and me like I hadn't slept in a month. But Maggie's real masterpiece was the photo op. She staged 20 worried mothers clutching kids at my property line, with a professional photographer snapping shots of their fearful faces while my farmhouse loomed in the background. The pictures hit Facebook with the hashtag #ProtectOurKids. On Channel 9, Maggie gave her best performance. Our children deserve safe neighborhoods, not whatever trauma he brought back from war. You know what? She was half right. I did bring something back from war: an ability to spot propaganda when it's used against me and the training to push back with strategy. Then Tony Riggs called with game-changing news. The EPA had already launched a federal probe into the Oak Ridge Creek diversion after my first complaint. And here's the kicker: Maggie's last HOA in Houston was fined $2.1 million for the exact same creek scheme. Federal environmental violations stick with people, no matter where they move. While Maggie was milking social media, I was uncovering that her entire HOA empire was built on fraud. Their construction loans were based on inflated property appraisals, and the banks only approved them because the HOA promised guaranteed water access. If those rights legally reverted back to me, the true owner, the whole development would collapse financially. The bitter irony wasn't lost on me. They had stolen my water to make their property valuable, and now greed was about to sink them. Maggie started to sweat. She tried bribing me with $400,000 in cash, demanding an answer within 48 hours. When I refused, she flew to California to corner my sister Emily with a sob story about her unstable veteran brother. That backfired spectacularly. Emily may not know Texas land law, but she knows me. She called, laughing. "Dan, some tennis skirt lady just tried to play the sympathy card. I told her if she bothers our family again, I'm calling the FBI." While Maggie burned bridges, I was building allies. I linked up with environmental attorney Amanda Cross, who handled water rights cases pro bono. Together, we organized a coalition of downstream farmers harmed by the creek diversion. Miguel Santos provided documentation showing his family had used creek water since 1888. Mrs. Chen offered black and white photos of her grandfather's thriving garden in the 1940s, nourished by that same creek now feeding Maggie's ornamental fountains. The local Audubon Society joined too, after learning the diversion had wiped out nesting areas for protected bird species. Destroying wildlife habitat while stealing water. That tends to catch federal attention quickly. Old habits die hard, so I kept doing nighttime reconnaissance. That's when I rediscovered something Pops had left behind. His 1979 design wasn't just a simple dirt dam, it included an emergency spillway with hydraulic gates that hadn't been opened since 1983. Testing the underground channels late one night, I heard the hollow roar of water echoing back. The system still worked, built specifically for moments like this, controlled flooding to restore natural flow. I ran the numbers. To return Oak Ridge Creek to its original path, I'd need to release 2.7 million gallons. Thanks to recent rains, the reservoir behind Pop's Dam held 3.1 million. The math lined up perfectly, but the timing had to be precise. I used my drone to map out the new home sites against the historic floodplain. 5 houses sat directly on the old creek bed. 3 more had basements below seasonal high water marks. Worse yet, their contractors had built fake, decorative creeks out of concrete and stones. They looked pretty, but they weren't designed for real water. Meanwhile, Pop's spillway had been engineered by the Army Corps for actual flood management. Then Maggie made her fatal error. Her crew began pouring permanent barriers to block the creek bed entirely. That would have destroyed the ecosystem forever, and it gave me the perfect reason to act. The weather forecast showed heavy September storms rolling in, the ideal cover for emergency dam maintenance. As I stood at the spillway controls one evening at sunset, I reread a journal entry Pops wrote decades ago about helping neighbors through droughts. My choice became clear. It was time to open the gates. Later that week, in yet another courthouse dig, I struck gold. Misfiled behind stacks of 1980 tax records was the original agricultural flood covenant for Pop's Dam. Its language was beautifully simple: operators shall preserve seasonal flow patterns to sustain downstream use. That single sentence wasn't just paperwork. It was my shield, and my sword. The downstream farms had water rights that were meant to last forever. This wasn't just permission to manage floods, it was a binding duty stronger than any HOA rules or city policies. But what Amanda Cross uncovered next was far worse. The HOA's insurance papers were full of lies. They claimed there was no seasonal flooding risk and that all agencies had approved the creek diversion, letting them lock in $47 million worth of coverage. Here's your third fact nugget: lying on insurance forms in development projects isn't just a civil issue, it can be a crime. When you hide environmental dangers, it becomes federal mail fraud, which can lead straight to prison. The more we investigated, the clearer the scheme became. Rick Thornwell's construction company wasn't just hired to build the homes, he was the main investor. Every single house built on my stolen land made him richer. And worse, he never once stepped aside from city council votes that pushed his own project forward. Tony Riggs then revealed an EPA report that made me furious. The creek diversion had wiped out every last Guadalupe bass, a protected species that had lived in Willow Creek for generations. Texas Parks and Wildlife confirmed the fish kill, but that report disappeared in Rick's office before it could lead to federal charges. This wasn't just theft of land and water, they were destroying an ecosystem. The final piece came from Amanda's banking sources. The loans for construction had been approved using fake environmental reports, which claimed the creek diversion was only temporary. The banks had been told the water would return to its natural path once building was done. But if the water rights went back to me, the entire project would break federal lending laws. That meant banks could demand the full $12 million loan balance instantly. Then, in the farmhouse attic, I found my grandfather's handwritten journals. One entry from 1980 broke me: opened spillway today. Helped the Santos farm and 3 others through the dry season. That's what neighbors do. The dam was never built for our family's gain. It was meant to serve everyone, helping farmers survive droughts and controlling floods to protect the valley. Reading those pages, I saw what Maggie had really taken. It wasn't only land or water, it was 45 years of trust and cooperation my grandfather had built with neighbors, one at a time. My engineering review confirmed my suspicion: Maggie's creek diversion was now creating a major flood risk upstream. Heavy rains would push water back into homes, while the old creek bed had been nature's flood barrier. The spillway my grandfather built was the only safe way to control seasonal floods. And time was running out. September storms were predicted to be the worst in 7 years. If I waited for appeals and federal red tape, nature itself would cause damage. But if I acted now, I could manage the water safely, proving the development violated federal environmental law. Standing at the spillway at sunset, my grandfather's journal in hand, the truth hit me hard. This wasn't about payback anymore. It was about restoring balance, protecting the community as my grandfather intended. Maggie had already broken the farming network apart. Miguel Santos had lost his family farm of 100 years. Mrs. Chen's generations-old garden dried up without creek water. 3 more families were forced to sell their land to Rick's shady deals. But the timing lined up. Federal investigators were set to arrive next month. If I showed natural flood patterns before their visit, it would expose every violation. The smell of old hydraulic oil and the sturdy dam equipment reminded me of my grandfather's foresight. He had built this system for exactly such a moment, for someone willing to defend the creek and community. As storm clouds rose in the distance, I knew what had to be done. It was time to carry forward his legacy and open the gates. This wasn't some reckless move, it was a carefully planned operation. It had legal backing, environmental proof, and community support. I gathered my allies. Amanda handled the legal push, filing federal complaints to bring maximum attention when the spillway opened. Tony Riggs made sure EPA inspectors would see what he called a natural flooding demonstration. Miguel Santos compiled 40 years of evidence showing how farmers had suffered from the diversion. And Mrs. Chen, the most respected elder in our neighborhood, offered her land as our base of operations, her presence giving us credibility we desperately needed. Amanda's plan was nothing short of genius. Amanda filed an emergency agricultural water rights restoration motion, arguing that the dam covenant legally required me to maintain seasonal flooding for downstream farms. We weren't breaking the law, we were enforcing it. Here's your knowledge nugget: agricultural water rights often supersede residential development claims, especially when backed by decades of documentation. My preparations were pure Army Corps engineering. I built detailed spillway operation plans: release starting 6 a.m., flow gradually rising over 4 hours, peak at 10 a.m. Calculations guaranteed a demonstration of natural flooding without damaging anything except Maggie's illegal barriers. Safety was my top priority. I posted warnings, notified the volunteer fire department, and made sure residents knew this was a controlled restoration, not reckless destruction. Amanda went on offense. She alerted environmental reporters from the Austin American-Statesman and lined up TV crews. Miguel rallied community witnesses to see agriculture restored with their own eyes. Our strategy was clear: control the narrative before Maggie painted me as a dangerous veteran terrorizing suburbia. Meanwhile, our intelligence network hummed. Mrs. Chen worked her gossip circuit inside the HOA. The diner waitress, Miguel's cousin, fed us updates on council backroom deals. My army buddy at Fort Hood even provided drone surveillance for legal documentation. While I rebuilt hydraulic systems, Amanda hit the HOA's financial lifelines. She sent insurance fraud evidence to regulators, challenged Rick's loan filings, and drafted whistleblower reports on his conflicts of interest. Timing was everything. Heavy rains predicted in 72 hours. Federal environmental inspection in 36. Agricultural agents arriving to certify crop recovery. It was a perfect storm: nature, law, and community converging. And I knew Maggie's playbook: emergency HOA meetings, smear campaigns, corrupt restraining orders. Amanda prepped counter-filings for each one. I preserved evidence: photos of diversions, videos of farmer testimony, historic records of the creek. Amanda secured it all in federal court. We even posted bilingual safety notices and built an unused evacuation plan just to show responsibility. Amanda layered economic warfare on top. She tipped banking regulators about Rick's fraud, contacted the Texas Attorney General, and drafted a civil RICO suit framing the HOA as a racketeering operation. Knowledge nugget: coordinated regulatory pressure can break a scheme faster than a single lawsuit. Multiple agencies mean defendants can't fight on all fronts. That evening, The smell of WD-40 and machine oil filled the air as I serviced every gate. The system worked flawlessly, just as Pops designed it. We fortified the farmhouse with supplies, encrypted radios, and protective court orders blocking interference. Storm clouds gathered. Federal inspectors inbound. Maggie booked for her morning TV smear. It was aligning perfectly. But Maggie wasn't done. Her desperation turned ugly. She hired private security, ex-military wannabes in tactical gear, patrolling my property like a war zone. Trail cameras caught them attempting sabotage at 2 a.m., pouring cement into hydraulic lines. Tony Riggs had already tipped the sheriff. When deputies rolled in with flashing lights, we caught Maggie's henchmen red-handed. Rodriguez had been watching from the tree line when the intruders tried again. Their arrest was almost poetic. One man in a camo vest claimed he was protecting community property from an unstable homeowner, but it's hard to explain away carrying a sack of quick-dry cement at 2 in the morning. Meanwhile, Maggie doubled down on her media game. She showed up on the Austin Sunrise show in a neat floral dress, voice quivering like a staged performance. With a tissue in hand, she declared, "Veterans deserve counseling, not control of dangerous dams." She painted me as someone turning war skills into suburban threats. Rick followed with his own scare tactics, giving an interview as a so-called expert engineer, warning of collapse, never mentioning that my dam had cleared every inspection for almost half a century. But while they crafted victim stories on TV, my surveillance training was quietly working. Every intrusion, every act of sabotage, every attempt to smear me was on record. Then Tony dropped a bombshell. Federal agents had been listening in on Rick's office phone for months as part of a corruption case. These people weren't just reckless, they were cornered. Their next move was legal warfare. Rick pushed through an emergency restraining order hearing at dawn, rushing it into Judge Henry Walsh's courtroom. Walsh was a golfing buddy, conveniently backed by campaign donations from Rick's construction firm. Amanda uncovered the tie and filed for the judge's removal, but we knew the outcome was already written. If they couldn't win in law, they'd twist the system with allies in robes. At the same time, Maggie staged her own blockade. About 20 HOA residents gathered outside my gates with lawn chairs, coolers, and "Protect Our Kids" signs, live streaming as if I were some villain about to drown a town. It was a staged showdown, families versus a supposed dangerous veteran. But we had our own support. Miguel rallied 30 farm families who depended on the creek for their crops. Mrs. Chen countered Maggie's show by displaying old photographs proving the creek's natural course. Amanda secured representatives from conservation groups to witness everything firsthand. Two clashing stories stood ready to collide. Things escalated when my cameras caught saboteurs dumping cement into the spillway channel to force a real hazard if I opened the gates. That wasn't just harassment, it was sabotage with deadly intent. I worked through the night with a jackhammer, removing every block, recording each piece as evidence. Exhaustion burned my throat with a metallic tang, but rage kept me steady. Rick then used his city council powers to brand my property a public hazard, and handed authority to the fire department to seize control. Thankfully, Chief Martinez, one of the last honest men, pulled me aside. "Daniel," he warned, "they'll force my hand in 6 hours. Make it count." Just then, Amanda's financial strikes landed. Her fraud reports triggered the state insurance board, and all HOA development coverage was frozen. Without insurance, Rick's projects ground to a halt. Money was finally slipping through their fingers. Tony then advanced the EPA inspection by a full day due to sabotage reports. Federal inspectors were now en route for 8 a.m., perfect timing. If the gates opened while they observed, it would stand as federal proof of responsible water management. Maggie's last attempt was the cruelest. She called Veteran Affairs, lying that I'd threatened self-harm. At 5:30 a.m., a VA worker arrived on my doorstep while I was preparing to open the spillway. I had to calmly prove I was stable while juggling the weight of the operation. The timing was brutal. Then Sarah phoned from California, her voice breaking. "Please, Daniel. I can't lose you, too. Dad wouldn't want this fight." For a second, doubt clawed at me. Then I opened my father's last journal, where he wrote about never bowing to bullies. My resolve hardened. Sometimes you have to flood the field to save the river. At 7:02 a.m., under the orange glow of dawn and with federal agents watching, I opened the spillway to just a quarter capacity. The sound wasn't destruction, it was restoration. For the first time in a year and a half, Willow Creek flowed where nature had carved it. Miguel knelt at the bank, scooping water into his rough hands, tears rolling down his cheeks. "This is the same stream that nourished my grandfather's land for 60 years, he whispered. Maggie's reaction was instant and ugly. The polished mask she wore for her morning show appearances shattered in front of the cameras. She shrieked at the federal agents, demanding they arrest me on the spot. Her voice cracked as she pointed wildly at the spillway, screaming about unstable veterans with weapons. But the water wasn't flooding houses, it was flowing exactly where the creek had carved its path for generations. EPA agent Sarah Kim stood steady, clipboard in hand. "Ma'am," she said firmly, "this landowner is operating a legal agricultural flood control system. What you're seeing is a natural creek being restored." Maggie, of course, was live streaming on Facebook, whipping herself into near hysteria. Helicopters circled overhead as the scene played out live on every major Austin channel. A reporter from the Statesman tried interviewing downstream farmers who were already celebrating the return of water to their fields. Maggie shoved her way into the shot, shouting that I was using combat training to terrorize civilians. The reporter, blinking in disbelief, asked her directly, "But the water is just flowing through its original channel. How is that an attack?" You could almost hear her script collapsing in real time. Meanwhile, Rick was in full meltdown mode, shouting into his phone from the courthouse steps. He bellowed to Judge Walsh about campaign contributions and collapsing property values, not realizing Amanda was standing close enough to record everything. Texas law only requires one-party consent to record a call, and Amanda was more than happy to be that party. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. Agent Kim's measurements confirmed what I'd known all along. The water flow matched historical seasonal levels exactly. Tony cataloged everything with military precision: photographs, flow charts, time-stamped drone footage. Downstream, Mrs. Chen's garden pipes gurgled to life for the first time in over a year. 3 farms reported water filling their stock ponds. Even the local diner owner rolled up with thermoses of coffee and warm kolaches, saying, "My daddy used to water cattle from this creek. Feels like it's finally back where it belongs." Slowly, Maggie's supporters began folding their lawn chairs and drifting away. It's hard to keep up a righteous protest when there's no actual disaster. The financial dominoes started to fall. State investigators slapped Rick's construction firm with a cease and desist order. All work on the subdivision halted overnight. Maggie discovered that even her own homeowner's insurance was in jeopardy, voided by the fraudulent claims about water access. She panicked, phoned Rick, and demanded he block the spillway. In a reckless move, he ordered 3 concrete trucks to, accidentally, dump their loads into the creek. Federal agents pounced immediately, arresting the drivers on felony charges for interfering with an environmental investigation. What Rick thought was a clever stunt had now turned into a federal crime. Technically, the operation was flawless. The spillway flowed within its natural banks. No flooding, no damage, only restoration. My Army Corps training had paid off, proving that precision and discipline could outlast corruption and lies. Politically, the fallout was volcanic. Councilman Martinez arrived at the scene, red-faced with anger but steady in his voice. He faced the cameras and declared, "This corruption has disgraced our city. Rick, your career is finished." Within hours, the federal probe expanded into organized fraud charges, RICO territory. Tony leaned over to me and whispered, "That's it. That's the nail in the coffin. But the moment that stuck with me most wasn't legal or technical, it was personal. When Maggie realized her $2.3 million investment was worthless without stolen water, she shrieked across the creek, "You've ruined everything, 35 families will suffer because of you." I looked her dead in the eye and spoke loud enough for every camera to catch it, "No, ma'am. I didn't destroy anything. I restored it. If those families want water, they can purchase rights legally, just like everyone else has to." She stormed away, ranting about lawsuits that would never see daylight. That evening, Miguel's family set out platters of homemade tamales and iced beer by the creek. Mrs. Chen prepared a small tea ceremony, blessing the water as it trickled into her irrigation lines. Neighbors gathered, laughing, hugging, some even crying at the sight of their creek returning after so many dry months. For the first time in years, this wasn't about property lines, politics, or power. It was about community, something my father had quietly built, one kind gesture at a time, during droughts long before I ever fought in uniform. The media narrative flipped overnight. Headlines no longer screamed, "Veteran floods neighborhood." Instead, they read, "Community reclaims stolen creek." Environmental groups praised the operation as a model for ecosystem restoration. And as I stood there with tamale grease on my fingers and cold beer in my hand, I realized something simple and true: water will always find its way home, and so will the truth. By 2 p.m., Judge Walsh's courtroom was packed wall to wall, reporters, farmers, HOA residents, even city officials, all waiting for the next chapter of a battle that had shifted from a lonely veteran struggle to a movement for fairness. And for the first time in years, I felt the tide was finally turning. Federal agents, reporters, farmers, and HOA residents packed Judge Walsh's courtroom until the air itself felt electric. Every seat was taken, with crowds pressed against the windows, desperate to witness what had become more than a hearing. It was a community reckoning. Maggie arrived first, flanked by a platoon of Houston lawyers in tailored three-piece suits, armed with binders of exhibits and an army of expert witnesses for hire. She had traded her tennis whites for a conservative black dress and pearls, carefully curating the image of a noble, community leader, bravely defending her neighbors. I arrived with Amanda. She wore confidence like armor, I wore Pop's old cowboy hat. Sometimes the most powerful statement isn't intimidation, it's authenticity. The gallery looked like a wedding gone bad. HOA supporters clutching, "Protect our kids" signs sat stiffly on one side, while weathered farmers and working families with calloused hands filled the other. The line between them wasn't just physical, it was moral. Maggie's lead attorney opened with dramatic flair, projecting photographs of muddy construction sites onto the screen and declaring that my reckless floodgate stunt caused $2.7 million in property damage. He wheeled in a psychiatrist who had never met me, but who happily diagnosed me as suffering combat revenge fantasies, based solely on old newspaper clippings. "Your Honor," the lawyer bellowed, pointing at me like I was a war criminal, "this disturbed veteran weaponized water itself." He turned his military training against innocent families. The courtroom murmured. Maggie folded her arms smugly, as if the victory were already hers. Then Amanda stood. Calm, sharp, devastating. She slid the original 1978 agricultural flood covenant onto the judge's bench, a legal requirement mandating seasonal water flow. EPA agent Sarah Kim followed with testimony, confirming that my spillway had done nothing more than restore natural creek patterns. Historical photographs proved today's water levels matched 60 years of seasonal records. Legal water rights, Amanda reminded the court, don't disappear just because a developer wants them gone. Then came the knockout. Tony Riggs, EPA enforcement officer, testified that the HOA had violated 3 separate federal environmental laws, committed insurance fraud, and destroyed protected wildlife habitat. Judge Walsh's face flushed as federal violations echoed through his courtroom. You could see the calculation behind his eyes: remain loyal to Rick, or risk obstruction of justice charges himself. The breaking point came when Amanda called Rick to the stand. Under oath, he admitted to pushing through zoning changes while I was overseas on deployment, and worse, revealed his financial stake in the construction company. When Amanda played the recording of him ranting about destroying property values, the gallery gasped. "This is a setup," Rick shouted, leaping from his chair and storming toward the exit. But it was too late. His own words hung in the air like a noose. Then came the community voices. Miguel Santos described 3 generations of farming dreams dried up when the creek was stolen. His voice cracked, and the silence in the courtroom carried his grief. Mrs. Chen displayed before and after photographs of her once lush family garden. Her calm dignity cut deeper than any legal argument. Fire Chief Martinez testified that the spillway had been professionally executed, with 0 safety violations. Downstream farmers confirmed their stock ponds were filled for the first time in years. Finally, Maggie took the stand. She trembled for effect, pointing at me as if I were a monster. "He came back from war broken," she said, voice quivering. "This is revenge. Environmental terrorism. Psychological warfare against children." Reporters scribbled furiously, but her words rang hollow against the mountain of evidence. Then Amanda called me. I took the stand wearing Pop's hat, his journals in my hand. I explained the decades of water sharing records, the Army Corps calculations, and my simple mission. "Your Honor, I didn't flood anybody. I restored a creek that was stolen from this community 45 years ago." The final blow came when Amanda unveiled proof that Maggie's Houston HOA had already paid $2.3 million in EPA fines for running an identical fraudulent creek diversion scheme. The federal prosecutor rose. His voice was steady, merciless. "This is now a criminal matter. The Department of Justice will pursue interstate water fraud charges." The room exploded, reporters shouting, cameras flashing, farmers cheering. Judge Walsh, cornered and visibly shaken, had no choice. He denied every one of Maggie's restraining order requests, ruled my spillway operation fully legal, and ordered the HOA to cease interference with federal investigations. His final warning to Rick was cold and cutting. "This court will not obstruct lawful federal environmental enforcement." Federal agents escorted Rick out in handcuffs while banking investigators served new warrants. Maggie, swarmed by reporters, offered no comment before fleeing in her BMW, likely straight to a realtor. I walked out to thunderous applause. Farmers cheered, neighbors hugged, and Amanda smiled like she had known this ending all along. And for the first time in 45 years, justice flowed as naturally as water finding its way home. The creek drew farmers, environmentalists, and curious townsfolk who watched justice flow like water finding its true path. Amanda stepped up at a surprise press conference to announce a federal racketeering investigation, while Miguel publicly thanked me on behalf of every family who'd been hurt. My words were simple: this was never revenge, it was about honoring the land and the people who depend on it. 6 months later, justice settled in like the creek itself. Rick Thornwell admitted guilt to federal conspiracy charges and was sentenced to 3 years behind bars. Maggie faced $8.7 million in civil penalties and filed bankruptcy faster than water through an open gate. The construction company coughed up $12 million in EPA fines and lost all federal contract privileges. The HOA dissolved completely, replaced by a new community group built around stewardship instead of control. My property value rebounded to $1.2 million after the federal environmental designation, making it worth more than any developer's plan. From the $340,000 insurance fraud settlement, I bought Miguel's family farm at tax auction and returned it to him, free of debt. Restoration often raises property values higher than development ever could, and the community's transformation proved it. The creek became a destination for ecotourism, kayaking, birdwatching, and fishing where luxury homes once loomed. Mrs. Chen's garden grew into a teaching site for sustainable farming, and 3 nearby farms reported their best harvest in 10 years. The diner became headquarters of the Willow Creek Restoration Association, where ranchers and activists strategized against corporate water theft. Success reached further than we dreamed. rare Guadalupe fish populations returned to pre-diversion levels in just 4 months, and the Audubon Society counted 12 bird species back in restored wetlands. Texas Parks and Wildlife declared the creek a protected corridor, permanently shielding it from exploitation. My careful operation of the spillway even landed as a case study in the Army Corps of Engineers training manual. Personally, I found a piece I didn't know I was missing. I rebuilt Pop's farmhouse with sustainable methods, and Sarah moved home from California to help run our growing agribusiness. Amanda and I, let's just say fighting side by side, forged a bond neither of us expected. The ripple spread across Texas. Advocacy groups used Willow Creek as their blueprint to fight illegal diversion statewide. Federal regulators even cited our case in drafting new water rights rules. Calls poured in from communities fighting HOA overreach, and I became an informal consultant. Together, we created the Pops Morrison Environmental Scholarship for rural students in water management. The first recipient? Miguel's daughter Maria, now studying environmental engineering at UT Austin, dedicated to defending watersheds against people like Maggie. The town launched Creek Days Festival, a celebration of restoration, food, music, and resilience. Proceeds funded a legal defense network that already helped 6 other towns push back against corporate water grabs. My favorite part? Kids splashing in the creek where concrete slabs were once planned, proof the community's stand mattered. Every Sunday, I visit Pop's grave with a mason jar of creek water, whispering, "Thanks, Pops." The creek's singing again. The Willow Creek Conservation Trust now owns development rights for the entire watershed, ensuring it will never be stolen again. And Maggie's downfall had a domino effect. Her Houston HOA faced its own RICO case, and 147 families across 3 states launched water restoration suits modeled after ours. What began as one veteran's fight grew into a movement for environmental justice across the country. From my porch, watching the creek flow where it belongs, I'm reminded that some battles are worth everything. You don't fight alone. You fight with your neighbors, your friends, and everyone who believes clean water belongs to all, not just the rich with lawyers and city hall connections. So if you're struggling with HOA abuse, water theft, or corrupt officials, don't give up. Keep records. Build alliances. The law will stand with you when you defend the land for future generations. Share your HOA nightmare in the comments. I read every one, because no one should fight these battles alone. Subscribe if you want more stories of communities beating corruption and winning. Next week, I'll tell you about the town that tried to seize my neighbor's solar farm, so she cut power to City Hall during the mayor's wedding. That's a whole other kind of power struggle. Remember this: water finds a way, justice finds a way, and united communities always win. Willow Creek runs free. And it always will.